Good evening, everyone here in this beautiful theater at Amerikahaus, Munich, and a warm welcome to all of you watching from wherever you are in the world as well. I had emails from Bucharest to Redmond, Oregon, so welcome, welcome. For those of you new to our events, my name is Bartley Grosser-Richter, and I'm the current president of the Yale Club of Germany and the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy. And we are a joint venture between the Yale Club and Munich's amerikahaus. So a warm welcome to you from all of us. Our guest tonight is a fellow member of the Yale Club of Germany based in Berlin. So we're very happy that he made the trek to Munich, Deutsche Bahn, to be with us tonight. Almost on time. Our topic tonight is tragically relevant this week, with a huge swath of Los Angeles burned to the ground over the past week. From what I saw yesterday, it's something like 62 square miles, which is an area larger than Paris. And this fire was not entirely because of, but fueled by, climate change. Yesterday in my inbox, I had an email from the Bernie Sanders team, and that's about as close as the US gets to a Green politician. And he wrote, quote, "The frightening reality is what we're seeing in Los Angeles today, unless we fundamentally change our energy policies, is likely what we will see in the future in the United States and throughout the world. There is no more fire season, not in America and not anywhere. What we are watching on the news in California is precisely what we mean when we talk about the existential threat of climate change." End quote. So tonight we'll be talking about climate radicals, why our environmental politics isn't working. Our guest and the author, Cameron Abadi, is the deputy editor at Foreign Policy and a co-host of their podcast Ones and Tooze with Adam Tooze from Columbia University. It's an economics podcast that I can highly recommend. It's really good. He previously worked as an editor at The New Republic and at Foreign Affairs, and as a freelance correspondent in Germany and in Iran. His writing has appeared in Bloomberg Businessweek, The New Yorker, The New Republic, Der Spiegel, etc. So Cameron's starting point is that Germany should have been a global leader in combating climate change. Its voters consider it a major issue, and they back arguably the world's most powerful Green Party. Except Germany's climate policies have been disappointing. So where's the disconnect? What happened? Why isn't it working? So in this book, he'll go into more detail. He profiles 3 of the activist groups in Germany, and he contrasts them with Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 in America, which represents the most significant move towards green energy in US history. So the question is, are Germany's activists hurting their cause? And what is the best way to implement necessary climate policies? So add to that mix that there's a new government being sworn in on Monday that has different ideas about climate in America. And we have snap elections taking place here in Germany, as hopefully you all know, on February 23rd. So the situation, it looks like from the polls, there will be German activists, remains. After his keynote talk, I'll come back up, and we do have time to take questions. So as always, we'll be using slido.com. I think the hashtag should come up, or the QR code, you can scan it, or go to slido.com. Those of you at home, go to slido.com, use hashtag amerikahaus, submit your questions, and they get sent to the iPad, and we'll try to do as many as we can with the time that we have. So the other thing is that Cameron is very well versed in all things politics, especially here in Germany, so we can also talk about that as well if we've got time. With that, I'll turn the microphone over to you, Cameron. Welcome to Munich, and thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, to everyone for coming out, to everyone watching at home. Very excited to hear your own questions after I speak a bit about the book and some of the ideas in it. And yeah, more broadly, thank you, Bartley, for making this possible. I studied at Yale and studied political theory. So was in the political science department, but really was approaching these issues from a philosophical perspective. And I think that bears on the topic of climate change and climate policy very directly, because climate change really raises some fundamental questions about politics, about our system of democracy. It really puts some of the assumptions of our politics that we don't normally have an opportunity to. Typically, there were sort of two ideas that I guess triggered the ideas that led to this book. One is that climate change is really unlike other political topics. Most political topics concern either questions of material distribution or cultural values, how to divide up money in the state, or how to express certain values that we may feel or share. We're seeing that right now in the ongoing election in Germany. Who should pay for our healthcare system? The climate change is a different issue, or works in a different way, because it's really determined by science, right? It is an issue that that scientists put on the agenda, and it's one that concerns not just money or values, but the basis for life on the planet at all. As scientists describe it, there are limits of what global warming, of what the planet can bear in terms of global warming. And those limits are what have been expressed in our international agreements. 1.5 degrees Celsius, an increase of temperature of that amount, has been determined as a critical threshold. And beyond that threshold, you start hitting, as scientists describe it, cascading effects that intensify and, in the worst case scenarios, lead to the apocalypse, right? I mean, sort of lead to life being unbearable. And so, unlike the other political issues, climate change is something that needs to be addressed. It's not something that is an optional political issue, but as scientists describe it, it's one that needs to be addressed. That leads to the second idea that led to this, that led to the ideas in this book, and that is, as a policy issue, climate change is also different. So it's not just the necessity that climate change needs to be addressed in our politics, it's also that it needs to be addressed in a certain amount of time, right? There's a clock that's ticking on climate policy. And that doesn't easily align with some of the parameters of our system of democracy as we know it. I mean, if we just define our democracy as a system of elections that we have, right? And the idea being that we organize our politics by organizing elections, by voting for our interests, and then allowing the parties after elections to basically reach compromises in terms of the trade-offs of those interests. Democracy works by discourse and compromise. And deferring through compromise questions to future elections, right? It allows revisions to be made. It allows reforms to be done in piecemeal fashion and then reconsidered in following elections. All of that doesn't really align with this necessity and the clock under which climate change is occurring. Again, there is a limits to what the planet can bear, and it doesn't. Those limits don't brook the kinds of compromises that democracy demands. And so these two ideas are clearly in tension with each other. The necessity in terms of the science of climate change and the necessity of compromise in our system of democracy. What's produced out of that tension? And as I sort of observe that tensions need to be resolved somehow. And if you observe our politics, I think you begin seeing how that begins to get resolved in ways that are uncomfortable. I mean, the first thing is that we do have climate reforms. We see those in countries around the world, and elsewhere in Europe, in Germany, in the United States. We see climate change policies being passed. And those all represent progress. And yet, those changes, those policies are insufficient. They're insufficient with respect to the goals that our politics has set. As I mentioned, there's an international agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement, that sets a 1.5 degree target for climate change. As some of you may have seen this past weeks, we have now already hit that threshold. And so for all of the policies we've passed, they're clearly insufficient, again, with respect to our own goals, with respect to politics' own goals. And so what that produces is, I describe in the book, as kinds of radicalism. And radicalism is a term that has proven to be pretty controversial. And I knew that going in, but I don't use the term in a pejorative sense. I don't mean to say that radicalism is an insult. Quite the opposite. In fact, it's a quite rational result of this process I'm describing. If we need to create change and the change doesn't happen, well, what is going to be produced is actors who try to seek progress outside of our normal democratic system. And this is most obvious, I think, in Germany. And I think Germany is a fascinating example. And it's a fascinating example for the United States. I think it's important for Germans specifically to understand this. I mean, on one hand, Germany is a industrialized country. It's a kind of peer of the United States and other major economies like China. And at the same time, it's unusual because it does have a consensus on climate change. This is not something that one should take for granted. The United States does not have a societal consensus on climate change. You have one of the two major parties essentially denies that climate change is real in its kind of explicit statements on the subject. In fact, we were just discussing beforehand how today there's hearings on the new head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in the United States for the coming administration. His main priority would be to abolish the agency that he would be heading. So this consensus that exists in Germany is a remarkable thing, and it is represented in the fact that all of the major parties, aside from the AfD, endorsed the Paris climate goals. I mean, that should not be taken for granted. And yet, even here, despite that consensus, progress hasn't been sufficient. And again, no country in the world has met those climate goals. The other thing that Germany has is a tradition of environmental activism. And one can see that tradition being drawn on right now in what is, in fact, the most widespread and most influential climate activist movement in the world. And you have a variety of groups who are networked with each other, who are distinct from one another, who share the same overarching goal of meeting our climate targets, but each of which has its own kind of theory of change, of how that can happen, and how democracy can be motivated from the outside to kind of make more progress. And Bartley mentioned some of the groups that I look at, and I think it's worth kind of examining them in turn a little bit tonight, because I think to some extent one has forgotten how this movement has grown and what's happened with it in the last several years. One of the major groups is Fridays for Future. In a sense, one doesn't hear so much about that group anymore, but it's a fascinating and an important example of an environmental activist group. And it traces its origins to the single climate protester Greta Thunberg in Sweden. But in the transition from Sweden to Germany, a significant shift happened. In Sweden, where Greta Thunberg started her protest, it was an individual protest. And it was an individual protest making a single moral claim. A moral claim based in Greta's own youth. And I think it's important to say that the power of that protest was rooted in the kind of innocence of her youth, and the kind of more moral outrage associated with the kind of violation of her future. As this movement moved to Germany, first of all, it became a mass movement. Several years ago, you had millions of people out on the streets in Germany, taking what had been this individual climate strike, making it a mass movement, mass climate strike, culminating with millions across society, encompassing young and old, and across all sectors of society. And the claims that the group was making were based in science. And I think that's most eloquently captured by the spokesperson, I think one could say, of the movement, Luisa Neubauer, who is a very eloquent university student who very eloquently drew on all the facts about climate change to describe the necessity of climate policy and motivated all these people to take to the streets. And the premise was that by demonstrating together the mass support, by demonstrating the facts at work, that would be sufficient to change the politics. And it clearly wasn't. And in fact, the high point of the movement was reached in 2018, at a point that the German government under Angela Merkel at the time was forced to respond to these millions of people. But the way they responded was with a very watered-down climate package that almost was a kind of an insult when you look at the details of it, given what the protesters were saying was necessary. It was so minimal what they offered in response that it was strangely insulting, and yet the response from the government was this was the necessary compromise, and that basically the science that the group was offering couldn't determine the political or economic trade-offs that were necessary in crafting policy. And so whatever the science said, policy was going to involve sacrifices by someone in society. And that's not something that scientists can impose. And that's what the politicians said. And they said, in fact, to suggest otherwise is single-minded, it's radical. And I don't think it's a coincidence that after that year that the Fridays for Future movement began to dissipate a bit. And you did have that energy started going into other modes of activism. I think it's important to say here that one of the modes of activism itself is represented in the Green Party. It is a party that is rooted in environmental activism, and specifically under the leadership of its current leader, Robert Habeck, envisioned being able to translate that energy, activist energy, into a societal consensus that would actually produce the necessary policy changes. Of course, we've seen the last several years the Green Party in office, and with Robert Habeck as the climate minister, that the changes have not been sufficient, and in fact, Habeck has been forced to make compromises of his own. In fact, Habeck famously, amid the war in Ukraine, traveled to countries in the Persian Gulf to make new deals, expanding fossil fuel sources for Germany, made new deals with the United States to receive LNG. Basically, his responsibility as minister to provide for the basic welfare of Germans superseded his ideas of how discourse could convince the public to produce the necessary change. So that effort came apart in its own way. And then you have finally groups like Letzte Generation that, in the face of these struggles, pursued different methods of change, and those famously included activists blockading streets, first in Berlin, but then in cities around Germany. And not just streets, but other types of infrastructure, airports, and basically to witness these kinds of protests, which I did, and I spoke with the activists there, is an impressive act of civil disobedience, in the sense that they are putting their bodies on the line, they are risking the legal consequences and risking their own bodily safety in some senses, because it turns out that when people are being impeded from their normal lives, they get angry and they begin to turn on the protesters themselves, sometimes in violent forms. This, of course, raises the question of what is the theory of change that Letzte Generation had. If you talk with them, they will talk about how by making society by disrupting society fundamentally, by making society impossible to manage. First of all, they're reflecting the breakdown of the climate, and they're as they would put it, they're coercing a change. They're saying that if society, if politics doesn't make the necessary changes, then society will be unmanageable. Of course, predictably, this produced kinds of backlash in politics. You, again, had politics instrumentalizing this radical protest, which, again, is reasonable in its own way, but instrumentalizing it to say that activism is fundamentally unreasonable. And it led to reversals of climate policy, or at least a decline in support for climate policy. And to some extent, I think it's fair to ask whether that may, in fact, be part of the point of what radical activists like Letzte Generation are up to. It may, in fact, be an expression of despair that is motivating their protests, and that's sometimes what I would hear, right? That in the face of the lack of progress, that they didn't even want to imagine that progress was possible anymore. They wanted to simply express their depression and their despair at that reality. And then finally, you have groups that are pursuing types of sabotage. And in a way, this is a kind of more material analysis of what is at work here, that by basically directly attacking fossil fuel interests, by making their assets less valuable, that one can weaken their position in society and then produce more progress in climate policy. Of course, to really produce a significant scale of sabotage, you would need more actors that are willing to pursue that kind of violent civil disobedience than has been the case. And so it's, I think, also worth questioning whether that has been effective either. You know, contrasting with all of this, again, is the United States, where, as we heard, a major climate reform policy was passed in the past administration. And in fact, a larger climate package than passed in Germany, despite the consensus in German politics. And I think it's worth briefly considering why and how this climate policy passed in the United States and the theory of politics at work there. And the basic way that the United States system of politics addressed this dilemma, this question of how to handle these sacrifices that democracies don't easily impose on the public. The way that the United States dealt with it, the Biden administration, was to simply avoid sacrifices at all. And if one looks at the climate policy that was passed, the phrase that often is used is it's all carrots, no sticks, right? All incentives to create progress on renewable energy, on e-autos, on all the necessary changes without punishing anyone. And in fact, while including fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel companies in the incentives. So a tremendous amount of money was made available without any disincentives being imposed on anyone. And this is obviously a compromise of its own in the sense that fossil fuel companies benefited, and they were happy to lobby for the law as a result of it. And the progress is real but insufficient. But it is worth pointing out that this method has depoliticized the issue a little bit in the United States. I think it was remarkable that this past election in the United States, climate policy was not a real issue, was not really present in the debates that the presidential candidates had. And in fact, if you start looking at the details of what's going on in Congress, you had Republican congressmen lobbying to keep this climate spending because it's happening in their districts. And so a sort of quiet depoliticization of this issue has happened in the United States as a result of this all carrots approach. But what it has not solved is the more fundamental dilemma of how do we produce the necessary change? And the clock is still ticking. And as I mentioned, we have met the threshold that we have all set. And so all of our system of politics is now in a moment of hypocrisy. But in terms of how to move forward from this point, I think it's worth emphasizing that hypocrisy in democratic politics is a minor sin, right? It is from a democratic perspective, it's often part of the system of politics. And I don't have answers in the book about how these dilemmas can be solved. But I do think that the using science and scientific measures as our framework for politics may itself be a mismatch that needs to be addressed. And I don't think it's a contradiction to say that we're making progress and the progress is not sufficient. I think that's actually something that Robert Habeck at different times acknowledges, usually not at the same place, but in different forms. He'll say, we've made more progress than ever before. That's correct. He'll also say, democracy cannot bear more change than we have passed, even if it's not sufficient. And that's not necessarily a contradiction. And so I think democracies are going to need to figure out language for talking about this issue that maybe is outside the boundaries of simple science. It's going to be, if we make more progress and if we make more radical progress, it's going to be because we want to, because we decide it's together that it's necessary. And we should also acknowledge that we may not meet our goals, and that's going to involve addressing some of the consequences of that. And if one talks to scientists, increasingly their conversation has moved on from the targets that we've set to talking much more about adaptation, what it's going to mean to adapt to a world with with the kinds of climate change that we've tried to avoid. And unless we talk about that, we're not going to be setting the money aside that's necessary for those goals. So I realize this is not necessarily an upbeat end, but I hope it's not a overly downbeat one either. I think again, progress is real, even if it's not sufficient, and yeah, that I think is the basis for thinking about these issues going forward. So thank you. I'm obviously happy to take any and all questions.
Thanks. Is this on? Yeah. You hear me? Good. Super. So thank you. We promised we're going to try to end on a positive note, too. We're not sure how, but we'll get there. So our democracy, I told you, our democracy book group met here Tuesday. We had 15 people. We had a spirited discussion of the book, and it was very interesting, based on what you just said, to see the different cultural. And we had one American, I don't know if you're here, who was a marketing person and fabulous. And she said, you just got to make it something people absolutely want. With marketing language, life is going to be so cool when we have renewables that you got to be on the boat for that. And I thought that was a very American way of looking at it, right? You're all going to have Bodenites, you know, warm feet.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Also because, I mean, I didn't mention that, but the climate activists in America supported this legislation. This compromise legislation, despite all of the downsides. And one often doesn't see that with the climate activists in Germany. They will point out all the downsides of various climate proposals. And, you know, America's climate activists too, but I think for interesting reasons, they came around to supporting these compromises.
Something's better than nothing, I guess.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't want to get pessimistic again, but I think there's one more aspect to this in the United States, which is one of the ways I think they got this, they managed to depoliticize it, is by also nationalizing it a little bit. So climate change became a national project. This idea that America can lead on this issue, and in fact, it's opposed to other countries. So it's opposed specifically to China, or it's also opposed to even friendly countries like those in Europe. And you saw these, you know, barriers being put in place, and this has led to controversies. But I think the sense of nationalism also produced some of the energy behind this legislation in America.
So it will be interesting to see what happens next week when. So as a reminder, Slido.com, and also those of you at home, Slido.com and the hashtag amerikahaus, you can ask your questions. But how would you describe the status quo of climate politics in Germany and the US given the elections? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so the US case, obviously, I could not predict in the book that Trump would be back in office. And that certainly raises new issues in the US context. I do think it's an open question about what exactly will happen because, as I mentioned, this climate spending is popular specifically in what are called red states, because it's often in red states that spending is happening. Ideologically, the Republican Party is still in denial about climate policy. But in practice, they'd like to keep the spending going. We'll see how that works out in practice. Trump's views are often contradictory, and we'll find out soon where exactly his priorities lie. But that's the case in the United States. In the German context, I think this Ampelregierung came in with very high hopes, especially in terms of its climate goals. This analogy of all carrots, no sticks, in the US case, actually did have an analogy in Germany, in the sense of there was this climate fund that was set aside, and they were basically trying to avoid all the trade-offs by having this big pot of money. And as soon as the Constitutional Court ruled that fund was ineligible for various technical reasons, the government found itself at an impasse. And I think that led directly to the collapse of the government, because all the questions they were trying to bracket became, again, about sacrifices, about trade-offs, about who's going to have to give what up, became unavoidable. And so, with this consensus that existed in Germany, I think just a few years ago, I think has started to come apart a little bit. I think formally it may still be the case that all the parties endorse the Paris climate goals.
Except one.
Except the AfD, which is a major party, important to say. But in practice now, you see a variety of parties really deprioritizing climate policy. And, even the Green Party is not making climate policy the center of its campaign right now. And so, this is I think it's worth reflecting on how much that's changed in just a few years. And I don't think, whatever the next government is in Germany, it's unlikely to be making climate a major priority.
Until more stuff burns down, probably.
Until more stuff burns down, exactly. And then it'll be one crisis after another.
Yeah.
And democratic politics is good at responding to crises that are short-term, but these long-term crises are another question.
All right. Thank you. We have lots of questions. So let me go with, how can countries like Germany adhere to climate change goals without jeopardizing their welfare states? I don't know, do you feel like job losses, factory closures? Is it possible, do you feel?
Well, it may not be. I think one of the questions that the US case raises is, can other countries afford to do what the United States did? I mean, this is hundreds of billions of dollars that the United States spent. The United States has a privileged position because of the US dollar, its role in international currency markets, its role as a financial reserve currency, et cetera. And so, Germany may not have that luxury. But without getting too political about this, it's also not necessary for Germany to have its debt rules that it has. Germany can afford to spend more than it does on whatever it would like to. There are international, currency, international lenders that are willing to give Germany money to spend. But Germany chooses not to do that. And so the sacrifices that Germany faces with its welfare state are self-imposed to some extent. So my answer to that question involves looking at the Schuldenbremse, this constitutional debt brake, and starting there, because I think that's a self-imposed constraint that is not necessary.
So the next one that is on legislative projects in the US and Germany. Fair to say that with Germany striving to drive change for 40 years, the US had much more low-hanging fruit to pick? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Say that again? I mean,
on legislative projects, fair to say that with Germany striving to drive change for 40 years, the US had much more low-hanging fruit to pick. Oh, because Germany did more with climate policy.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the climate activist movement in Germany, it's interesting how they draw on the recent tradition of activism that goes back several decades in Germany. Sometimes I do raise the question of whether the precedents that they cite are entirely relevant. So, the climate activists tend to point to the anti-nuclear movement. That's the example that they point to as the example of civil disobedience that produced the change that they wanted. But that was one source of energy in Germany that over multiple decades of protest eventually got phased out. And we're now talking about much more widespread changes in society that are necessary. And so, yes, there is a tradition of environmental policy in Germany. But in the US case, I'm not sure that it's just low-hanging fruit. The legislation was very ambitious. It's worth saying that. I mean, it is the kind of spending and the kind of priorities that any country ought to be targeting, at least on the positive sides of the US legislation. So I don't know if it was just low-hanging fruit, but just a kind of different political approach.
On the nuclear note, quite a few people like the question, do you think Germany will revisit the taboo of nuclear energy given its ability to be recycled and help limit our carbon footprint?
Yes, so this is a distinct issue in Germany, as everyone who lives in Germany quickly learns. Every country is different in its history, in its cultural assumptions, and the role of nuclear energy in Germany is a very distinct one. There's a tradition of treating nuclear energy as a threat and as for a variety of reasons. It's also important to say that. There are multiple overlapping reasons that nuclear energy is seen as a problem in Germany, and so I don't think it's likely to be revisited in the German context. And it's important to say, partly because of that, it's become no longer even an economic possibility in Germany. It's not even a sensible energy source anymore because of the political hurdles involved in pursuing it here and the protests that would be triggered. From a US context, or from a context of many other countries, it would be a very obvious place to start. It's sometimes something that it confuses outsiders. But I don't think the question of addressing it or is likely to happen. It's just become it's neither politically nor, I think, economically feasible.
Okay. So there's a question here that goes with one from the book group too, about democracy not being maybe the best form of governance for climate policy. Regarding the three activists' approach, Or no, this is does one need to rethink the capitalistic society to meet climate goals?
Yeah, I think this is a question that I think is also at the foundation of some of the questions about climate policy. And one, in talking with these activists, would often hear this, that to meet our climate goals would require an end to economic growth, and that capitalism is ultimately the source of the problem, and that and it's an interesting debate to have. Again, because there's no country in the world that is meeting its climate goals.
So authoritarianism isn't doing any better?
Well, China is making major progress, but they are also continuing with their fossil fuel consumption as well. So they're not necessarily on pace. They've set very ambitious targets, but they're not necessarily on pace if you were to track that. But to get to the question at hand, the academic question of whether capitalism is at the root of the problem is not necessarily a political intervention. I mean, and that's the thing, is that when one would talk to these activists, they would say, okay, let's say capitalism is the problem, then what? What is the next step? And then there was never an answer. There was never, and basically it leads to questions of revolution, which were always vague and never entirely thought out. And so, it may be a kind of interesting academic question of whether capitalism is the source of the issue, but it's not really a point that politics can easily accommodate or absorb in that way, and that's, I think, reflected in the kinds of protests that, again, I think were more expressions of despair than really thought out descriptions of political change.
So I'm going to modify this question a little bit about the three climate groups. Do you think that have they had something that was effective?
I do think I don't want to be too dismissive of Fridays for Future, first of all. They put climate change on the political agenda in I think, some very concrete and traceable ways. They forced the political system to respond. Of course, how the political system responded was not under their control and not to their liking ultimately. But civil disobedience, again, these radical interventions in politics, I think it's a very proud tradition. I don't mean to say that civil disobedience is not is not effective in its own terms. But I do still think that climate policy is distinct. I mean, all the other examples of civil disobedience, the ones that activists cite, are not necessarily analogous to this issue, and I think that's reflected in the lack. Although Fridays for Future put this on the agenda, the result was disappointing.
It's not like getting the vote for women or seats on the bus.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, those are the civil rights movement in America. Obviously, is the most cited example, but I think that's an instructive example. I mean, the civil rights movement in America. We focus on the 1960s as this critical time. But of course, the history of the civil rights movement goes back decades, centuries before that. And the getting to the tipping point where equal rights were achieved in America was a process of a long struggle, and ultimately getting to the point where there were material circumstances where basically segregation was isolated to an increasingly kind of smaller economic base. And at some point, it was more easily toppled, that system of segregation. We're talking now about a rapid transformation of the entire system of the economy in a very short period of time. And you know, the analogy with the civil rights movement, I think, sometimes is a difficult one to easily make.
There's a question here. I'm going to modify it too. The question is, are there countries or governments that, in your opinion, do climate politics nearly perfectly? I would just say, who's doing it better? Who's doing a better job?
Who's doing it better? You know, I think one interesting example is the European Union as a whole. I think that didn't come up yet, but you know, the European Union as a collection of countries is pursuing ambitious policies, including in the form of a Green New Deal, including in setting very ambitious targets, including in setting, I think importantly, in ways that are not yet, I think, widely acknowledged enough, including in the form of carbon pricing. Of course, I think the question that's raised with the European Union is that it's also not easily a fit with what we normally think of as democracy. I mean, it's a forum of politics that is a bit more separated from our democratic discourse in our national countries in Europe. And so I often think that the question of Europe's targets, the question of how those get translated to the national level, I think, is where the proof, you know, is what ultimately matters. And so I reserve judgment about whether Europe's policies will ultimately get translated to the national level or how effective they'll be. But I think how Europe pursues these issues, I think, deserves credit for being forthright and for being ambitious. And the question of how relatively democratic it is, I think, is a separate question.
Might be more effective.
Might be more effective, but you know, the question is it as democratic? And then we get into these issues, you know, especially then when it gets into real sacrifices, you're going to start getting resentments and of the kinds that we also see in Europe. So.
Here's one. Even if Germany succeeded with the climate plans, or let's say Europe, what about the environmental impact of bigger, poorer countries outside EU or US, like India and China, et cetera? Does that make this all?
Yeah, I think that the future of climate change is ultimately going to be involve questions of development of the rest of the world. I mean, we're talking about countries, in talking about democratic countries, we tend to be talking about countries that are already industrialized, already developed in Europe and the United States. But much of the rest of the world is not yet developed and not yet industrialized, and there's no precedent for that rate, you know, for achieving those that economic development without impacting the climate. And so, yes, the question of the future of climate change is going to rest with countries like China and India.
Sub-Saharan Africa. Too.
Sub-Saharan Africa. I think, yeah, that certainly and I think this also, I think this is an important point to raise to get back to the question about capitalism, because as much as activists may be correct to point out that the role of capitalism in producing the pollution that has resulted in climate change, to target capitalism would mean to be depriving potentially much of the rest of the world of the industrial development that we currently enjoy. So that becomes its own tension as well. But you know, there are democratic issues involved in. I think focusing on the West is, I think, worthwhile, precisely because We've already achieved the level of development. We've already achieved the level of industry, and we've already impacted the climate. So in a sense, we have more of a responsibility to do something to change our ways now, as opposed to countries that are trying to reach our level.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've got questions that go in two different directions. One, the politician looks at the next election, the statesman at the next generation. Given the situation in, we're talking about Germany and the US, do you see any statesmen around who can help us with this? Or do you think we're surrounded by politicians?
I would turn back to the example of Robert Habeck. And I think Robert Habeck is a fascinating figure because he, I think, is very aware of all these questions we're discussing tonight. And he, I think, has tried to develop a theory for solving them. And if you look at his writing, and one interesting thing I saw was that he specifically cited Barack Obama as an example. I mean, he sort of sees Barack Obama as a figure, as someone who, through the power of discourse, could persuade the public about necessary changes. And so I think there's a theory at work there that he wants to be a statesman. But in practice, it came apart. I mean, it came apart in ways that I think he couldn't easily predict. And a statesman, we could say, has their eye on the future. But a statesman also is obliged to also have the immediate, the fundamental needs of the country as well. And I think this was where, as climate minister, I think Habeck saw himself as being responsible by making the compromises he was making. He would say, that's statesmanlike. I made the necessary compromises. But it clearly involved the sacrifice of some of the more ambitious goals. So, I mean, at least I think he's asking the right questions. So I see the potential for a statesman there in that sense, but I don't know if in practice it'll work out that way.
Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to try to combine some questions here. There's a question about the three different activist approaches, the key lessons from each of them, and about civil disobedience, so in the same sense, what might be the options of this in the United States if they really blow up the EPA and withdraw from all of the treaties?
Yeah. So the examples of the three groups that I discuss in the book, I think, I discussed Fridays for Future already about their approach to knowledge and science as a kind of centering at the center of their theory of change. I think there's, again, they put the issue on the agenda, so the credit to them for that. I think there is something bracing about the Letzte Generation protests, I think. This kind of cry of despair.
Are they the ones that are gluing themselves to the streets?
They're the ones gluing themselves.
Yeah, throwing soup at paintings.
And throwing soup at paintings. And there's an honesty in this, because again, when our system of politics is saying we have these goals, when we're saying that this is necessary, and then we don't do enough or don't do anything sometimes to achieve those goals, well, why should one not be despairing at that? There's an honesty, I think, to that I think is worth confronting. It may not be a practical proposal, but it is an expression of, I think, something real in our politics. And in terms of like sabotage, that I think is taking an honest look at some of the material interests involved in these questions. Because it's not just the climate policy is not just ultimately about ideas about the planet, or it's about very material interests that need to be that in some cases need to be sacrificed, including fossil fuel interests, or including tax rates on citizens, or so addressing the material interests involved directly, I think deserves some credit. And I think this bears on the question of the U.S. case, because I think one of the logics at work in the U.S. legislation is to the hope is that there will be a renewable energy sector that will be an interest of its own, that can compete with fossil fuel companies. I think that the idea is that by throwing enough money out to renewable energy companies, that they then will be able to, basically stand their own ground against fossil fuel interests. And I think activists in the U.S. can support this growing renewable energy sector. I mean, I think drawing on some of these tactics from the German case may be useful, but I would maintain, I guess, the willingness to support compromised legislation. Ultimately, I think that they managed in the U.S., but that the German activists have generally not done.
Relooking at the word hypocrisy. Right? Okay. Let's see. One more. Thank you, guys. There are so many questions here. I really apologize if I didn't get to yours. And there's some that are really deep in the weeds that I'm afraid we'll save it for afterwards if you still want to and you're in here, about ETS and global certificates and stuff. What role does the Energy Charter Treaty play in the climate debate?
Energy Charter Treaty.
Do you know what that is? I don't know what that is.
Doesn't immediately trigger. Maybe
Okay. If Germany were to implement a carrot approach now, should it also try to take back climate-harming subventions? Are there such subventions in the U.S. system? Yeah. So these
subsidies, right? I think you'd say in English.
Yeah.
Yes, there are all sorts of subsidies in the U.S. case being given to fossil fuel interests, and I think ultimately to achieve necessary progress, you'll need to weaken fossil fuel interests, and that will involve reducing their subsidies. The question of the proper order, in which to pursue these things, I think is another question. Obviously, in the U.S. case, the decision was made not to take away anything from anyone yet. The decision was to give things out. And then, somewhere down the line, maybe, either there will be a push to claw back some subsidies, or it will just be a market. It will be a market principle that basically renewables will outcompete fossil fuels. Maybe you won't even need to reduce the subsidies. Maybe the fossil fuels will be maybe renewables will be so successful that the market will take care of it. That's I think the assumption in the U.S. case. In Germany, again, I think the question of whether one can afford to spend the money without making sacrifices is one question. Whether these self-imposed constraints about debt are necessary. And then even if one acknowledges that the subsidies should be taken away from fossil fuel interests, et cetera, what's the right order? Should they happen simultaneously? Should you try to sort of quietly build up the renewable sector before you try to impose disincentives and punishments on fossil fuels. I think you could do both at the same time, and it would be maybe more affordable that way. But politically, it may be easier to approach it in the U.S. sense.
Well, we will see, won't we? Coming
we
up.
We will know soon, I think, about, and I do hope that Germany, that this consensus is re-energized here, because it is, I think, a unique and important example of pursuing climate policy in a real communal way. And obviously it didn't work out the way we wanted in the last few years in Germany, but I think that consensus is almost a necessary condition to kind of making progress going forward. So hopefully it's not just a formal consensus, but a real energized consensus again. And we will see soon enough what the new German government wants to do on these issues.
That's probably as positive as we're going to get to close tonight with this topic. Thank you so much for your book. I must tell you guys, I didn't know that this imprint existed.
Yeah.
And it says, our books are short, novella length, and readable in a few hours, but ambitious. They offer new ways of looking at and understanding the major issues of our time. Most readers are curious and busy. Our books are for them. I feel seen. I think it's fabulous. It's really good.
I can endorse the other books put out by this imprint. They're called Columbia Global Reports. And that's the premise. The premise is that there's a lot of issues that deserve more than a kind of magazine article would be able to offer, but less than a huge, full-sized volume would offer as well.
Busy people.
So exactly.
We do have some books
I believe there are books here for sale.
There are, and this is great.
And I'd be happy to talk with anyone afterwards and sign books as well if anyone is interested. So
super. So real quick, I just want to do a thank you to the amerikahaus for hosting us, and to the team in back, who's fantastic as always. Thank you. Yeah. And to the program team, Dominic and Nina. Follow their program online if you want. They have over 400 events a year. They've got a great program, so I'm plugging it now. I also want to thank all of you who have donated to keep us going and make these possible. We've got an incredibly generous and wonderful community here, and I'm incredibly appreciative. Cameron, do you want to tell us how to follow you? Are you on Blue Sky?
I am still a remnant on Twitter. You can find me there. I find it difficult to call it X, but otherwise, do follow foreign policy, because we try to not just cover these issues, but all issues around the world, and we put out new articles every day, and our podcast.
And the podcast, it's really good. Ones and twos.
It's an economics podcast, but as I mentioned, I'm not an economist, and so I try to make it accessible for people of all backgrounds, and I think we try to talk about the economic sides of all sorts of non-economic issues. So you can check that out as well.
Okay, I'll put that up on our website. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to look at our website, dialoguesondemocracy.com. You can sign up just to receive emails so you know what we're doing. And Cameron has graciously offered to sign books. We have a reception out back for those of you who are here, so we can move the discussion to the foyer. And for those of you who are joining us online, thank you so much. Thanks for coming tonight.